And the research that I had been doing, I hadn't thought of as particularly pertinent to gender. When I got sex differences in some studies, I was irritated because I had to factor it out in doing the analysis of the things I was really interested in. And however, Carol Jacklin came and wanted to be a postdoc with me. We had a long talk. At that time, I was having a disagreement with Sandy Bem, who was in our department. And she had come to me and said she thought that I should not publish certain things that I had been publishing because this was information which might conceivably redound to the disadvantage of women. And I did not feel that way. I thought that what science said, you published any interesting, solid finding that you had. And when Carol came, she and I discussed this because she was much more intensely feminist than I was. And we agreed, the truth shall make you free, is the way she put it. And we agreed that if we did research together, we would publish what we found. Carol and I started to work on parent-child interaction with little children, and this time, instead of counting on interviews with parents, we were doing observations of parents interacting with kids of, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and so on. And this got to be very, very demanding and very interesting stuff. And meanwhile, we became more and more irritated about some of the stuff that was being said about women. And I remember particularly when I read a clinical psychologist, Freudian, who published this business of the essential difference between the sexes is that males are active, females are passive. I said, passive? What in the world can anybody mean? And I had a colleague in psychiatry, had also done work as an anthropologist in Africa. He had showed me his slides. And here was this picture of a woman trotting fast across the compound, carrying a heavy bucket of water to start preparing lunch for her family. There were women in the fields with the baby on their back, busily tilling the soil or planting rice or something. And a woman coming back about 5 o'clock in the morning from having gone out to gather wood for the day's cooking, this huge bundle of wood on top of her head, walking along briskly. And then a picture of the men in the community sitting around, as you're sitting right now, passing on the oral traditions of the culture. And I admit that my selection of their slides was a little bit biased, but I wanted to make that point. I used to use that in lectures when I said how outrageous it was to talk about women as passive. Maybe dominated and subservient, but that's quite different. Anyway, we began to notice other things where we were doubtful about this, and we finally said, well, let's see if we can put together the evidence for what sex differences there are. And so we began to comb the literature, and then we hired a little group of 3 undergraduates, I believe it was. Carol supervised them mostly, to go over all the literature. And then we began to realize we knew about studies that had been done where there had been both male and female subjects, but we'd look at their publications, there would be nothing in there about sex differences. We started calling them up, and they'd say, oh yeah, of course we analyzed for gender, but there were no differences, so we didn't publish them. And this turned out to be a huge source of bias in the literature, because there was one study, let me think, yes, it was on the prisoner's dilemma, and women were said to sell out their partners more often than men would. There had been almost 30 replications of that that found no difference, and they didn't publish it. So we began systematically calling people who were doing studies that had gender comparisons potentially to find out if they'd looked for them, to find out if they were positive or negative. Now, obviously, we could not do a very systematic study of that. None of us will ever know how many no difference findings there are that weren't published. But we put in as many of those as we could find. And it did really help to balance the picture a lot. And as you know, the upshot of that book, its basic message was most of what we think about as differences, essential differences between the sexes, are myths. They aren't true. Well, now, this came out at just the time when it was the field of women's studies perfectly ready to receive this message. This was what feminism was all about in those days. Men and women are alike. Let's stop stereotyping them with all these labels which are not true.